Electricity is in the news now more than maybe ever before. The price of electricity is rising. We'll need more of it in the future than we currently produce, and electrifying how we heat our homes and how we transport ourselves from place to place is seen as key to fighting climate change. It's a true moment of transformative disruption in the energy industry. Big tech companies need huge amounts of electricity to power their artificial intelligence, and New England has placed large bets on new sources coming online in the form of wind and hydropower. State and federal officials are under intense political pressure to provide relief for struggling ratepayers. What does our region's grid operator make of this moment? I'm Jordan Wolman, senior reporter here at CommonWealth Beacon, and this is the codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. It's a special episode because today I'm coming to you from the ISO New England offices in Holyoke, where I'm joined by Dr. Vamsi Chadalavada, President and CEO of ISO New England. Thank you so much, Vamsi, for coming on the show, and I'm so glad to be here with you.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you for making the time to come visit with us and for this opportunity to speak to you. Many of the topics that you raised in your introduction, I think, are really critical issues, and particularly the point you touch on affordability. Almost every conversation that I have in many forums, it starts with that. And I think being in New England, as an organization that's tasked with providing reliability for New England, we want to lean into the concerns of New England. And, we are a service organization, and it's our job to participate in these conversations in a meaningful way. But the factors you laid out, I've been here in New England now for 21 years. And in my experience here and prior to this, when I worked at Siemens, it's the time that I recall as being the most volatile. Volatile in terms of the uncertainties that we're faced with. There's so many conflicting factors that come into play with no obvious and easy way to solve for them. Demand is growing. Climate change and the policies that are necessary to tackle that is at the forefront in the region. Data centers and actually the supply chain logistics that come with it have also contributed to the degree of difficulty. Siting and permitting have become challenging. And so how do you then find a way through all of this? And so for us, what is our strategy going to be in the next 5 to 7 years? And so we're trying to look at this in a way that balances the many critical elements that need to go into a solid decision. Our primary mission is reliability. We want to achieve that through wholesale markets. Under the whole premise that competitive markets are the single most pragmatic way to lower the cost for consumers, because the risk is borne not by ratepayers, but by the investors. And so when I say that reliability through markets is our primary goal, but we also need to balance that against affordability, against the decarbonization objectives, the environmental consciousness. And so we have a series of steps that we're taking, which I'd be happy to get into during the rest of our conversation on how we see this. It's not going to be one option or one approach, but it's going to be a series of, I think, deliberate steps that the grid operator, ISO New England in this case, has to take in partnership with the states and the federal policymakers as well. And of course, the industry, which is a critical component to making all of this work.
Vamsi, I think I'd love to have our listeners, before we get into some of the meat here, learn a little bit more about you. You were born in India and you moved to the U.S. for grad school, and you're relatively new to the role, but not new to ISO New England, as you said. You've been here for 21 years. Also learned you're a pretty big sports fan.
Yes, I am. I'm a big NFL and college football fan.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work. I mean, I think for the layperson, it's complicated and maybe even inaccessible. So I'd love to hear about how you got here and how you approach it.
Jordan, so I'll try to keep it brief just so that we can talk about maybe New England.
Sure.
But I came to this country because of its appeal, right? I was 8,000 miles away, and this was in the pre-internet days in 1990 when information was still through mail, postal mail, where you get catalogs of universities and the promise of what you could study if you had the opportunity to be at one of the universities in the United States. So I did my undergraduate degree and came here wanting to pursue a master's. I've always been fascinated by engineering. Once I got here and finished my master's, I just wanted to study and understand more of the many variables that are in this ecosystem, and so I stayed on and did my PhD. After which I then worked for Siemens for about 10 years, and it was in that period of time that I had the opportunity to travel all over the world, dozens of countries. And it sort of offered a direct insight into different cultures, different ways of how people serve electricity, how markets are formed, what's working, what's not working, what systems are in play, and just the experience of being in dozens of countries was, I think, very rewarding. And then I came to New England because I had a small family at that time, and the travel was really exhausting physically and mentally, and that's probably the best decision that I can look back in my professional career, because coming here gave me an opportunity to learn over the past 21 years of how everything comes together. The policy is important, the engineering is important, relationships are important, economics is important, costs, environment. How does all of this fit into this one neat puzzle so that ratepayers get what they are expecting, which is electricity that is reliable, and in a regional policy prerogative also that is mostly from clean energy sources. And it's that intersection that the grid operator sits. So while we don't really have a direct role in policy, the opportunity to work with policymakers on what I think is a very important alignment aspect of all of these functions has been just rewarding. And so I feel it's prepared me well because I've had a chance to work on many projects in New England, meet many of the industry players in New England, the states, and build some relationships. So I come into this role with a humility about how difficult the job is and how much we need to do, but also with some confidence that we have the talent. We have the opportunity to really set the stage and show the way forward for not just the nation, but maybe be a model for the world. And so that's exciting. And so that's really where I think all of our energies are going to lie for the upcoming period of time.
I think that's a great sort of table setter. You sort of mentioned in your initial, statement that we're at a critical moment for electricity. I mean, we talked about demand is expected to rise, and now we have AI data centers sort of in the mix. Is the New England energy system prepared to handle this influx in demand while maintaining reliability? Like, do we have the grid we need and the transmission that's necessary to make this all work, especially as we start to transition to a system that's going to peak in winter?
So I think of it as two separate tracks that ultimately need to be connected, but we have to solve for this along two different pathways. The first is native load, demand, our industry, native industry, economic growth engine that it is, residential needs, which is expected to grow about 10% over the next several years, right? So how do we cater to that? That is our bread and butter. That is just the way the economy grows organically. And so we have, I think, tools in our toolkit that allow us to cater to that pathway. And there's this new pathway that's emerging from data centers and from large loads, which could be explosive in its nature and intense and time limited in how quickly they can come on board. And then how do you cater to that class of customers in a way that doesn't implicate the normal ratepayers on a day-to-day basis with the costs that incurred from serving these large loads? So we're looking at building a separate sort of system that caters to the large loads, where we ask them to bring their own generation, where they're paying for their own transmission, where all the costs that are incurred in New England as a result of those large loads being situated aren't passed through to ratepayers that are, residents of New England. And so that's just the work that's underway. We just made some recent commitments to our regulator in this regard. And so we think we're well positioned to bifurcate the two sort of ways that we think about serving our load, native load and then the large loads, as two distinct, important both, of course, but as two distinct pathways.
Affordability is the word of the day. We know that prices are going up. They're about double the national average in Massachusetts. I think there's a hunger to understand why. Well, why is that the case? And is there a role for the ISO in New England to play a role in making electricity more affordable?
That's a great question, Jordan. There is so much that goes into the costs that ratepayers have to pay to make sure that the lights stay on. Any retail bill in New England has various pieces to it. As the ISO, there are parts of the retail bill that we have some control over. It is in how we design wholesale markets, and it's how we plan for transmission. And we take that to heart. So when we look at what are the things that we can do, the first and most important thing is any design that we roll out, we have to convince ourselves first, and then make sure that we take the time to be transparent and have this conversation with all of our stakeholders on why it's cost effective. Maintaining reliability is difficult because in an economy that is growing, which is a good thing, when supply is constrained, which is not so good, the margins tighten. And when margins tighten, prices do go up. And this is on top of what has been some antiquated distribution side infrastructure that also needs to be simultaneously upgraded to take in the policy implications of heat pumps and transportation, electrification, and also building electrification. So that requires its own sort of set of cost growth just to make sure that the grid is built to cater to this future policy and climate change goals that New England has. But that's not all, right? Then now we're further confounded by supply chain issues where either labor shortages or manufacturing shortages. Energy is a growing commodity around the world, so it's a worldwide competition for products and goods, so prices go up as a result of that. And lastly, our neighboring areas, New York and Quebec, on whom we have traditionally relied on to supply energy, are also experiencing tightening margins. So the confidence with which we could maybe in previous years count on them to give us energy when we need it the most is less so now. So against that backdrop, then how do you create a solution set that still gets to the heart of what is the affordability crisis, right? And so for us, our first step is to make sure that we maximize the existing grid in every way we can. The resources that we have today in New England, we want to make sure they stick around for 10 years. Maybe it wasn't as much of an imperative when we had the opportunity to get some offshore wind and maybe more energy from Quebec, but in the absence of those opportunities, the existing fleet becomes very critical for us. So we want to make sure our markets, and therefore the investors that are investing in these markets, find a way, the right incentive to keep the existing resources at least through the early 2030s. Then we have to look for ways on how we can get incremental supply, whether it's long duration storage or other incremental forms of supply. And then the last point I'll make is demand side management, right? It's very important, I think, in New England for us to start focusing, and the grid operator to help in this sort of initiative, on how can we make sure demand plays a more critical role? How can we make demand flexibility an important aspect of operating the grid? You can imagine on a really hot day or a cold day, or when there are bad events happening in terms of contingencies on the system, if we can count that there's going to be some demand that can be curtailed, that allows us to spend less on infrastructure in the short run. And those all add up over time. But we have to pursue each of these, and they're not optional. I think they all together hopefully at least keep the lid on the growth at which the costs are growing.
So you touched on a lot of things that I want to get to. And one of the things you said is you're talking about demand response. You're talking about keeping the existing energy assets online, at least for the foreseeable future, while looking having one eye to the future to add more to meet the rising demand. What role do you play in that? Because when I think of those things, I think of, the state DPU setting, incentives for using electricity, running your dishwasher at night. I think of, state officials securing contracts with energy providers, like in the case of offshore wind. So where's ISO fitting into that? Or is it, not to minimize it, but is it just in terms of advocating for what you think the grid needs with the state decision makers?
That's a great question. So let me take the first one and then get to the demand side. In terms of our role for the existing resources, that's the whole purpose for competitive markets. And we are hoping that there are enough incentives in our markets. Of course, we have to calibrate the levers in this market in a way that balances the risk of participating against the incentives for behavior that we want in the market. So we have all the tools that we need through markets to make sure our existing resources stay for at least the foreseeable future. And I think of that as 7 to 8 year increments of time. So from now into the early 2030s is our first step in wanting to make sure these resources stay online. In terms of demand, you're right that the states have a clearly critical and important and primary role. We think of us as sort of being a partner in that regard because each state in its own initiative on how it chooses to maximize demand flexibility, can we create a more collective initiative that benefits New England at large? So how can we create an alignment within each of the New England states? And how can that then be aligned with wholesale markets? So as an example, we want to make sure that when the demand is being asked to be curtailed, it is at a time that we truly need it, where the grid truly needs it. So given that we are operating at the bulk level and much of this is at the retail level, there's, I think, an alignment issue that we want to make sure is clean, clear, understood, and transparent. Because if you don't get that right, we may be colliding. We may be not having an issue on the system when demand is being asked to curtail. And when we do have issues, maybe there's a fatigue on the demand side and there's an unwillingness to be curtailed. So we want to create, I'll say this, Jordan, to you, it's a long ways from being a realization. But I have this vision that we have a platform in New England that's state of the art, that is something that doesn't exist in the world today. Operated by the states, the grid operator, or an independent party, doesn't matter, but a platform that takes all of this input and maximizes the output. And so rather than having it be that each initiative, each program is its own end to itself, can we make sure that the sum of the parts outperforms? And goes back to my analogy of football, it's like the Seattle Seahawks, right? They may not have the best player at every position, but as a team, they were clearly so good last year.
I love it, Vamsi, and you're dangling this little side plot we could go down, but I'm gonna try to keep us on course here. So another thing that you mentioned is decarbonization. The big question is, how do we get off gas? I mean, I check the ISO New England website regularly. Day-to-day basis, it's not uncommon for me to see that 50%, sometimes more, of our system is being run by gas. There are, in my mind, two big projects in New England to try to cut into that. One is offshore wind. People forget that the offshore wind industry, was really struggling even before President Trump took office again in 2025. Then he took office and things unraveled from there. Is that a power source that you think you can count on in the future? Like when you're actually modeling and projecting out, trying to meet this rising demand, that 10% growth over a decade that you mentioned, where is offshore wind fitting into that puzzle?
A few years ago, we could see a way through our reliance on oil in particular, less so gas. Gas was always going to be a staple in our toolkit just because you need it for ramping, you need it for contingencies, you need it for the variability that comes with relying on weather dependent sources. So that was always going to be a part of, I think, the resource stack. Offshore wind is one of the most energy density source that we could find, right? I think 8 gigawatts of offshore wind, if I could go back in time, was going to be a game changer for New England in terms of our reliance on fossil fuels. So in the absence of that volume of offshore wind, though it would be great if it makes a comeback in the years to come, but absent that, we'll have to look at every opportunity we get. Long duration 2-hour batteries are maybe the greatest way for us to store energy. So maybe there's long duration battery that offers a better vehicle in the short run. Small modular reactors are still a ways away, and it's then to be seen on the confidence level with which they can be deployed in New England. So for us, what are our options? So we have oil, we have gas, we have limited offshore wind, and we have some onshore wind, and we're going to have storage.
And nuclear.
And nuclear, of
Right.
course, and then the imports that we can count on, at least to the volume that the states have signed contracts for. So that's really our resource mix today. And there'll be some incremental additions in storage, and there'll be some incremental uprates in how some of the combined cycle units may add a few megawatts here and there, but nearly nothing sufficient to close this 10% gap. We think of dual fuel units that run only on gas, being able to also, in times of shortages of gas, being able to switch to oil is a cost-effective way to buy us some time. So we're going to be talking about that quite a bit with our stakeholders and with the industry and with the states and with our regulator on how can we move that forward. Because at the core of all of this is still reliability. We still need to make sure that consumers have the benefit and that they deserve of reliable electricity. Because if that goal is compromised, almost everything falls apart. So to achieve that goal of reliable electricity, dual fuel is, I think, a very legitimate and necessary option in New England. And these are conversations that we've had. But this is where I think demand flexibility could also play a key role. If we utilize and mobilize the right volume of demand response, not just at the retail level, but also at the wholesale level, we have markets. Can we create an incentive structure at the wholesale level? There are going to be incentive structures at the retail level. And can we collect up an aggregate volume of demand that gives us the time? Because right now we need to buy some time. We need 5 to 7 years of confidence and certainty that we have enough resources to meet load. And I have confidence that technology moves at such a rapid pace. There's going to be different industries that come forward with different solutions. In my estimation, and what the ISO is focused on is, can we, if we're asked the question at all times, confidently state that we feel good about the next 7 years? And so it's hard for me at this point to have the same level of emphasis on 2040 or 2050. I just want to make sure we have the confidence to 2034 first. If we get there, then our objective is, what do we need to build as the next sort of step in this journey to get us to the early 40s? When we get there, then we can talk about then the ultimate journey. So we're chunking it up into shorter duration steps so we can be more pragmatic. And this is also the time to be pragmatic. And this is where communication, relationships, solidarity, consensus, durability all come into play. It's not about what the grid operator says, because our control is very limited and we need authority to really pursue any initiative. But can we provide the right information? Can we be a trusted partner in New England? Do people have the confidence that when we say, here are the tools, here is the information, here are our recommendations, that it merits a good sort of discussion within the industry and state and ISO partnership environment. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve in the next few months, actually.
Kind of sounds like you're holding on tight, batten down the hatches. Let's make it through this whatever winter storm for the next 7 years. So I'm not hearing a ton of like confidence in offshore wind's rebound and its ability to, in the near term at least, because that sounds like that's where your focus is, for that to provide a durable
Maybe I would
forward.
state it slightly differently. I think when you say near term, yes, the next 7, we have to make sure we get through the early 30s
Yeah.
because that has to be the first step.
Sure.
Because if there's a crisis that unfolds in the next couple of years, I think we lose a lot of the future because that becomes then the crisis that everybody reacts to, and then
And because the margins are so thin as they are. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we want to just have a solid game plan that gets us there. But we also want to make sure that the steps that we take during this period of time are no regrets, that we're not making investments that are lost monies. Going back to the concern about affordability.
Yeah.
If we have to spend money, we want to make sure that money isn't just for the next 7 years, but that that's money that is being spent that will last for 30 years. But once we get to that point, when it gets to offshore wind, I think the industry has been beaten down so much at this point. Even if you wanted to try to jumpstart it, it's going to be, I would say, 8 to 10 years away because you just need to go back to the basics of permitting and siting and contracting and construction,
Right.
which then gets us to the supply chain issues. And then what is the confidence within the offshore industry that this time will be different and they're going to have the confidence to put in the tens of billions of dollars that are needed, right? I think what's lost in all of this, Jordan, is at the end of the day, the surest way to benefit ratepayers is to make sure that private capital comes to New England and that investors invest in New England, because that is how markets are supposed to work. When industry and private capital gets deployed in New England, it spares expenses for ratepayers, and that is the surest form of success. So we want to do everything we can on our end, and I know the states are equally motivated, and so there's an opportunity here to take care of the near term while we are not losing sight of the future. Not worried about the future in the sense of being panicked, but being very methodical and pragmatic about how you solve for it.
So I talked about 2 big projects to add clean energy into New England. So the second one is the New England Clean Energy Connect, this hydropower transmission line from Canada into New England. It's had fits and starts since it started earlier this year. At least twice now. It's shut down entirely at different points. I know it's early, but I still think it's worth thinking through if this project has been successful so far. And I'd be curious, too, if you could speak to the project, but also to this broader thinking about interregional collaboration with Canada, because Governor Healy, Massachusetts, has sort of floated the prospect of doing offshore wind or wind in general with Canada. So I think it's worth thinking through just the overall concept as well. Like, is this a smart thing to pursue, or do we just need to take care of ourselves? Because Canada is going to be faced with similar things. They're going to be faced with rising electricity demand, drought, etc. So I would love to hear your thoughts about both the project and the general thinking behind the project.
So let's talk about the project first. That went into service during the coldest winter that we've had in 20 years. So the timing was a bit unfortunate of how the launch of that project coincided with the harshest winter we've had. And as you said, it's had some fits and starts. I see that, so the first, on the positive, it's certainly any source of supply adds to the resilience in New England, right? So all sources of energy and energy injection is a positive story for New England. So I think that is something that we can be thankful for. It gives us another source. So if we lose something, we have the New England Clean Energy Connect as a vehicle to protect us. But there are also, I think, areas of improvement. Much of the energy that's supplied across that line is now congested in the state of Maine. So it's not delivered to the rest of New England. So we need to solve for that transmission congestion. Just yesterday, we released a recommendation to solve for that problem. So it's going to take some years, but we can get through that. We're going to improve it's like, think of it as a highway, right? We want to make sure that more energy can come from the north to south New England. And so we're going to beef up the transmission corridors from Maine to New Hampshire. And we just made that recommendation to the states on which project to pick, and hopefully that moves forward. But I do share your view that the margins that are tightening in New York and Quebec are, I think, a new development. It's been a quick development over the last 18 months, 2 years, but it's real. The surplus margins that Quebec was expecting aren't the case. In fact, during many of the hours this year, we were exporting to Quebec, as was New York. New York's margins are tightening at a rapid clip, too. So when we think of interregional collaboration, unless it's a much broader footprint, which includes the Midwest or the larger eastern sort of seaboard, if it's just New York and Quebec and New England, each of the areas are tight on margins. The benefits under stressed conditions are going to be somewhat nominal. And so I've shared with states and with our industry my view that investments in interregional transmission to New York and Quebec going forward may not have the same return on investment as investing within New England, in sources of energy within New England. And so that is, we have to do the work to see if that's a hypothesis or if we can validate it with some data. But if we're asked to do it, we'll lean into that. But that's just the way I see the universe. And it just is playing out this summer also. We didn't get the support that we thought because, when there's an extended heat wave, it affects New York. And the way the climate change has really been sort of borne out is that these cold snaps and heat waves are over extended geographic locations. So they just don't sit over, a couple of states in New England. They hover over Quebec, New York, and New England. And so when you also add to that, we're going to be winter peaking soon. We need to have the confidence that our reliance isn't at the hands of a neighboring area that may be going through its own sort of uncertainties. So we do have to sort of take that into consideration in our decision making.
Have to get your take on data centers. It's just have to talk about it. We know that New England hasn't seen the explosion of these facilities as in other parts of the country, but there's maybe this feeling that it's only a matter of time, and maybe that's right or wrong, but it does sort of feel like, okay, maybe we're slower to, that tech companies are slower to try to site these facilities here, but it's just, they're not going to totally skip this region either. I don't know if you shared that view, but I would imagine it's part of your thinking and talking about quick moving developments. This has been a fast moving development, including around how states are responding. I mean, we see, public polling on this topic and sort of a rising backlash, I think, from consumers, but state officials, I think, are increasingly, at least in New England, unsure how to embrace this, sort of new economic wave. In Massachusetts, there was a data center tax credit that, in theory, you would think would try to bring them to Massachusetts. Governor Healy has since paused that tax credit, I think, as officials again try to find their way here and where they should land politically on this issue. That aside, obviously, I don't expect you to speak to that. I would like to hear from you about what you're expecting in New England with respect to data centers and their energy demand.
I do think they're going to come to New England. I think there's going to be a bit of a lag, but eventually data centers want to locate next to where some of the tech hubs are. And there are some hubs in New England that I think the data centers would want to be close to because of the latency of data and the way that innovation requires that latency. So how do we set up the right guardrails? I think a key sort of expectation is that the costs of those data centers don't transfer to ratepayers. I think we've taken the right steps to protect against that. The next is how quickly can we build up the transmission to interconnect them? But while the transmission development may take some time, can we then take a little bit of risk? But if these are large loads, they need to be signing up to this as well, where we let them connect to the grid, but we manage their interruption anytime there's a period of stress on the system. So think of it as not firm transmission service, but curtailable service. And so we make sure native load is always load served, and if we can't serve all of the large load, then we ask them to come offline. So there are tools that we can put in place from an operational and grid reliability standpoint. And then that leaves us with the most difficult problem. How do we find new sources of energy to supply this large load? And this is where we feel that large loads are best positioned to either bilaterally or otherwise source their own energy. And whether it's in the form of clean energy or whether it's in the form of other sources of energy, we're going to be very clear with our regulator that it's our expectation, and we're going to be making some tariff filings that essentially formalize this protocol, that if you're going to build in New England and you're a 0.5 gigawatt large load, you need to bring a 0.5 gigawatt of energy with it. And then we'll work with you on the engineering, we'll work with you on the interconnection in conjunction with the state and the local transmission owner. But so long as we are clear and transparent about the rules of the game and learn from the lessons of the rest of the nation, I think we're going to be better positioned. And some of the mistakes and lessons learned from other regions is that when you don't have a very transparent and clear structure, it creates this sort of confusion, and then before you know it, the costs are upon ratepayers with no clear way to unpack those costs. So I think we have had the good fortune in this instance of being more deliberate about it. And so I'm more confident we won't see that ratepayer impact, but there's still a lot more work to do on the interconnection, transmission, and resource adequacy side. But we're setting up the rules, and there's something neat about having clear rules. Because once you know what's expected of you, then people can self-select if they are willing to subscribe and play with that set of rules, or if they would prefer to go to a different location. With all that said, Jordan, I think the most important thing that we've been talking about at the ISO is balance, right? There's no way that we can say this is the one most important thing and focus just on that. There are just too many uncertainties. And like I started at the beginning of our conversation, I've never seen a period of time where there are so many uncertainties, each of which, or any of which, could undo your entire sort of solution set if you're not careful. So it is running those scenarios. It is making sure you have the confidence, you've studied it, you've built the tools. And I'll make an example. We used to study extreme weather as what if it gets cold by this amount, or what if there's snowfall of 2 to 3 feet. We used to study very discrete scenarios, 5, 6, or 7 every year. But weather could play havoc on New England in millions of ways. So now we built a toolkit that allows us to study millions of probabilities. Once you know that you have the capability to study the continuum of outcomes, you can then decide what's the place that you want to position to solve for this problem and to mitigate the risk. And so I think a similar approach, I think, is necessary for resource adequacy and for the future of New England on all of the uncertainties that are facing us.
It's a little head spinning.
But it's necessary, and we have the confidence that we have the right people, we have the right system, we have the right structure, and we have great support from the states and from our industry. So I feel like we can get there. It's going to take a little bit of time, and we need a little bit of patience. And I think we also need to be very clean and clear with our ratepayers and where things are and what they should expect from us.
You've mentioned your regulator a couple of times. That's FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I wanted to ask you about your relationship with FERC. For one, we're living in an interesting moment in a number of ways. And in that sense, in this case, I mean, President Trump has sought to undermine independence of some of these independent agencies at the federal level. And I wonder how things have felt, honestly, since you took this role, since Trump took office again in 2025. Do things feel more politicized with FERC? If so, how? Or just in general, has there been a tilt in the axis of your relationship with FERC in any way?
Jordan, I think our relationship with our regulator and with the Department of Energy is very strong. This past winter was a perfect illustration. The level of support and their willingness to help us and their being available for us was extraordinary. And so I still think when there's a moment of need, there's nothing that comes in the way in the form of politics. And I think this past cold winter really demonstrated that firsthand, where I was in those direct conversations. And I also take great comfort that they're all professionals. And I think that when we talk about issues, we talk about them in what needs to be done, why they need to be done, and how it helps New England. And we found them to be very supportive. So I have not sensed any sort of discomfort in that regard. And I'm thankful for the regulators and their willingness to support us and the relationships that we've been able to build with them.
I think I'll probably do one more question following up on your point about this past winter, which is that we saw oil-fired generation really spike during the cold snap, which really felt all winter to me because it was quite cold. Did that concern you? Like, how can we avoid that in the future? I mean, I maybe from a market perspective, it's okay, but from a climate perspective, it's not. And from an economic standpoint, it's really not either, I would think. But obviously, correct me if you feel otherwise. But I would just like to bring that up because I think it caught a lot of people's attention. It's funny. I think sometimes people have short memories. Like in the summer, it's hard to think about the winter, and in the winter, it's hard to think about the summer. But you need to think about this all the time. And so winter is not that far away, like it always is. So talk to me about what you saw this past winter and if it was concerning to you and how to maybe avoid that going forward.
So first, let's talk about the cost side of it. The way, because of the fuel infrastructure constraints, especially gas constraints in New England that have been long documented, the price of gas is really, really high. And so oil is much cheaper in the winter. So the economics of burning oil, as much as the environmental impact is much worse, from an economic standpoint, oil is much cheaper. So that setting that aside, we are going to rely on oil for the next several winters. I wish that weren't the case, but it's just the fact. We just do not have the diversity of resources to be able to wean off of oil. And that was the promise of offshore wind several years ago, which would have been a game changer in the winter.
That's the contrast, right?
That's right.
Is the contrast. Offshore wind potentially could have reduced or maybe eliminated the need to burn oil in the winter.
That's exactly
I think that's important to say.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, our studies, we've shown this. It's not just theory. We have actually done analytical work, and our data shows that 8 gigawatts of offshore wind would have made a meaningful difference and very impactful difference in the resource stack and where the energy would be coming from. And it's that picture that I think, much to the chagrin of New England, and unfortunately so, just changed over the last 2 years. And when I talked earlier about we could see the light at the end of the tunnel, it was the promise of that offshore wind, just not across New England, but also down the coastline to New Jersey, Virginia, New York. So will that come back? I hope it does. I hope it comes back as soon as practical. But it really isn't intuitive to me on if it's feasible in the next 7 years, absent some extraordinary interventions and actions.
I think that's all the time we have for today. So, Vamsi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jordan. Really enjoyed it, and thank you for visiting with us again.
Thanks again to Dr. Vamsi Chadalavada for joining us on the codcast, and thank you for listening. I'm Jordan Wolman. Our production and theme music is done by Camila, Ulian, and Charlie Koczela. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. And we'll be back in your ears next week.